It's my great pleasure, in fact, to be here today. And you should believe me that I'm really telling you the truth. Because I left Vienna, it was snowing there, it was a snowstorm. It took me only 24 hours to get here door to door. Meanwhile, I got sick, but it's okay. But you know, having those long flights is always fun. You pick up all kinds of stuff to read, which you'll probably never read, and this is one of those that I picked up on the plane. It's called News in the Digital Age. I believe this is quite much Google ad, because there is Google everywhere. But there was an article here about matters of fact. So it talks about, in fact, the low trust in, this is an article devoted to news media, but it goes around and talks about the trustworthiness of media and such. And they cite, in fact, one of the researches done in the EU, where it says that 59% of radio listeners only trust whatever they hear. So it's only 59%. For the TV, it's even worse. It's only 50%. And for the people who read news, it's 47%. In other words, there is almost half of the things we read we don't really trust. Brian, in his presentation, mentioned this morning the use of AI. So there's an interesting thing, if you read the article to the end, and it's a kind of long one. There is a company, kind of a startup in Romania. It's called Trust Servista. They realized this, and they did, in fact, design a software using AI, which does the trustworthiness check. And they do it daily on 60,000 different articles. They have the whole spectrum of criteria how they do it. They're not happy with that. They want to increase this number to 180,000 articles a day. So this is, in fact, kind of an introduction to what I will be talking about. This is what is gray, and when is gray too gray. I will be talking mainly about the data, but generally speaking, the whole area is the same. So the main question here is, in fact, why are we concerned about the graying of the gray data? There are at least two reasons for that. The first one is the actual amount of data, and the second one is this, what I just mentioned, is the trustworthiness. When we say that there are 2.5 exabytes of data produced every day, I believe that doesn't mean anything to probably almost any one of us. But if we say, because the 2.5 is just a number, exabytes is too high a number to understand. But if you say that, this is 250,000 libraries of Congress created every day, that really means a lot. We can relate to that. 90% of that data has been created, in fact, over the last 2 years. And then you can read about the rest, like there are 13 million text messages sent every minute. There are 4.4 million videos viewed, and the one which I really find interesting is that 1.7 megabytes of new information is being created every second for every human on the planet. I would say the most interesting part there is that 99.5%, and this is the data from some of the research, has never been used or probably will never be used at all. Also, when we say about the Google, because this is the powerhouse, interesting fact is that 15% of all searches were completely new, done almost daily. Trustworthiness, we can read there about what do we consider as a trustworthiness of facts, which is conformity to actual facts, the habitual truthfulness, authenticity, information source reliability, and security. There are 269 billion emails sent and received every day. And talking about trustworthiness, it's 60% of that is in fact spam. 56% of all traffic on the web is in fact from automated sources like hacking tools, scrapers, spammers, bots, etc. So yes, this is what I will try to address here, talking about the gray literature, the data types, the gray data, the shades of gray data, gray data and synthetic data, which I found also a very interesting one. Unsettling days and grays, and some conclusions which I will offer at the end. This is the definition of the gray literature, which is slightly adjusted, the general one, which was done in Prague, and I did some changes here, and in fact, also in Prague, in one of the conferences of gray literature. And the main elements of this definition are that it's being recorded, that the gray literature should be referable, sustainable, that it could be either data or the information. It has to have value. It needs to be publicly available, and there were lots of presentations this morning, in fact, mentioning exactly that. And that usually comes without a traditional peer review process. When we are talking about the data types, and I like this, that gray is something between extremes of black and white. There are lots of types of gray literature, and in fact, the gray literature website, in fact, the GrayNet, offers about 150 different types, which includes, and this is of importance here, the databases, data sets, data sheets, data papers, satellite data, product data, and you name it. The one part which I will be only working on, is talking about, is in fact the data sets. When we are talking about the white data, we are also in fact using it as a synonym for the open data. And there are different entities. There was also already a definition mentioned by Wikipedia, but there is also some other sources, and I'll just quickly go to some of them, which is, for example, Wikipedia is saying it's freely available to everyone to use and republish as they wish, without restrictions for copyright, patents, and other mechanisms of control. The International Open Data Charter is probably one of the most comprehensive ones. It talks about open by default, timely and comprehensive, and so on and so on, and for inclusive development and information, which is in fact the purpose of the data itself. The European Union, in fact, is very much after the open so-called government data, OGD. It refers to information collected, produced, or paid for the public bodies, and can be freely used, modified, and shared by anyone for any purpose. It's kind of a similar thing what, in fact, the US government also is defining as under the US Federal Open Data Policy in 13, that open data refers to publicly available data structured in a way that enables data to fully be discoverable and usable by the end users. The other countries around the world are not far behind. So, for example, when we are talking about Russia, they go quite far, in fact. They talk a little bit about the actual legislature, but at the end of this definition, you can see that they also define the formats that the data should be published in. They go like CSV, XML, JSON, RDF, and they also put mandatory that the metadata format should be also included, as well as some of the technical requirements. China is also one of those countries that is quite much after the scientific data being open and openly available. And a friend of mine is just now, in fact, attending a conference in Berlin, which is devoted to open data. And he just texted me a message there saying that they had a representative of China talking very much about exactly this, how China is opening the data through the policies and so on. And we have also Japan, which has a quite good definition of open government data. When we are talking about the dark data, it's information assets that organizations do collect, do process, and store during the regular business activities, but generally fail to use for other purposes. For example, analytics, business relationships, and direct monetizing. In other words, they use it, but they store it, but they don't really use it. And since I come from the nuclear background, nuclear science, it's similar to what we call to dark matter. In physics, it's something that comprises most of the universe, but it's in fact very hard to define and to put hands on. Organizations do retain the dark data for compliance purposes generally, but that also creates lots of problems. For example, the problem with the amount of data being stored, the risk that brings, and all kinds of nowadays privacy and other things. I like the Gartner definition saying that, or the guidelines more than a definition, that by 2020 there will be at least 10% of organizations that will have a business unit for making their data commercially available. When we are talking about the gray data, it's a type of great literature that maintains its basic facets such as being recorded, referable, sustainable, and those are the things that I already mentioned at the very beginning. It's also being used as an umbrella term that describes the vast array of data that organizations collect and use. It's useful and valuable data not vetted by peer review or other governance mechanisms, and so on. I try to put this into kind of perspective because as human beings, we like to see things organized. We like to see things visually. So I try to put here that, for example, some of the facets compared to white, gray, and dark data. And as you can see that from the white, you have almost all of them, although not every single white document is peer-reviewed. But in gray, you have some basic elements missing, like is it really public or not? Is it peer-reviewed? Probably not. And for the dark, missing most of those elements here too. It doesn't show nicely, but they are really, the actual items, in fact, are listed in the shades of gray. And we can talk about at least 4 parts of it, which is data in the context of grade system theory. The anonymous data is defined by EU, and unstructured data is called unmanaged or so-called risky data. When we were talking about the system theory, I was surprised that, in fact, when you look at it, there is very little written about it, although it's a very powerful theory which was based on, in a time when everyone was concerned about 80s, when everyone is concerned about decision-making processes and decision-making systems, the use of expert systems and so on. That was the methodology, in fact, focusing mainly on data which involves small samples and usually is poor information. This is, in fact, one of those theories, how to make a decision when you don't have enough insufficient data or sometimes even unreliable data. I like the way this is taken, in fact, from the actual publication in 2012, how it was listing different concepts and the situations, because they do talk about black, gray, and white. When we are talking about anonymous data is defined by EU, it's in fact a legal EU term coming from the General Data Protection Regulation, and it's dealing in fact with the reuse of personal data or the data which is being processed for purposes beyond its original collection, and anyone knows that this is a very tricky thing, even in the scientific research when you have all these consent forms and everything, and you say this will be used for this, and then someone comes and tells you, okay, fine, this has to be republished somewhere or stored somewhere, and of course the purpose that initially the data was collected is in fact being changed. So there is lots, I believe, here too, legal discussions about how to overcome that. One of them is, in fact, to anonymize the data which is being collected, which means things like age, gender, education, status, employment, and so on are in fact being removed from the actual data set being collected. When we are talking about the unstructured data, anyone who's in computer business, they will say, well, of course, it's definitely not the one which can go into the relational database. So yes, that's true, but nowadays, the world of relational database is much more developed, much stronger, and so on. So it does include text documents, email messages, and all these other things which don't go into so-called structured data, but it does exist as probably one of the types of gray data which should be regarded with a great type of shade in respect of the accuracy, the transparency, and so on. It does include images, AV files, and some other tools. I mentioned here also the AI because especially the artificial intelligence, the machine learning, and so on, will probably help with analysis of this type of so-called unstructured data. Unmanaged risky data. This is when we are talking about the organizations and we go into the so-called dark data. According to some research, there is 30% of the corporate storage space is filled with so-called active data. 40% of the data stored is inert and needs to be kept for archival or most of the time, in fact, for regulatory purposes. 30% of the storage is used by unmanaged data. This is the one talking here. And this is also worth noting that 15% of dark so-called storage allocated it's allocated storage but unused. 10% is so-called orphan data that should have been discarded a long time ago. And of course, there's even a 5% of that that should have never been put in there in the first place. There are also some obvious risk with that, which is data clutter, reliability, and security breaches, which do come from this type of data being stored. There is not to mention the cost of maintenance, although the hard disk and so on is going down, but still there is lots of cost for so-called backups, disaster recovery, and some other things. It does require also the data governance, which is very difficult there because there are no standards. There is lifecycle management is non-existent, and the compliance to some regulations or internal standards is probably missing, as well as the quality control. And I hope you have time to read some of those fun facts, like the shades of gray and so on. I just listed 4 instead of all them. One of the very interesting types of gray data, in fact, is something called synthetic data. It's interesting, where would we put this as a gray when we are talking about, yes, it is gray, but is it really dark or is it just gray and so on? This is the type of data where the artificially manufactured data is required. So in other words, it's not the data which is measured, it's not the real life data, it is something which is being artificially produced for a specific purpose. Usually the data is stripped of anything that could be used for any type of identification and so on, but it's generally being used for, by AI system for training them for whatever the purpose they have. So the computer would go and create out of nothing something which resembles the original data and put it into the system for the training. So this is the reason it's called, in fact, synthetic, because it never, in fact, existed. And this time I am going to read the one which is at the bottom there, the fun fact, because this is, we all hear about, this self-driven cars and Waymo, in fact, which is behind the Google car. And that's really something to think about when we are talking about synthetic data, because anonymous vehicles have been used for testing and driving 8 million miles in the real data, and another 5 billion miles on, in fact, a simulator or synthetic data. So you can see how big is the value of this type of data. Unsettling gray, there are 2 parts of that, like when we are talking about the warning signs. The first one is the data, or are the data. Actually, we had just a discussion about is it data is or data are. So this is, in fact, the data is, as a first warning sign, in fact, is it unverifiable? Is it inaccurate, like fake data, fake news, and so on? Is it coming with an unclear structure? Is the difficult analysis, like formats, tools, not available? Is it under its inscription or redundancy? So those are the warning signs when we are talking about the so-called unsettling gray, in fact, trying to look at the veracity of the data and its trustworthiness. But there is also another element which is called, which we can group under the purpose. So if and quite often the actual data source or the data itself comes from a questionable source. And I always, when I have a chance, I like to talk about the role of librarians, the information specialists, and so on. And that's their role there, in fact, to verify those questionable resources and to come up with something which is really worth visiting and checking and using. There is also lots of missing information. There is information or data with hidden intent. There's data abuse, and of course, defaming, which is quite often. There was mentioning here this morning about so-called fair data, and it's becoming like a mantra. Everyone is talking about findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But everyone, I think, is forgetting one element there. This is done by computer guys. This is something that, the computer experts who are running hardware, software, developing algorithms, and so on would say, okay, fine, I need to find it, I need this. But there is a crucial element being forgotten here. Is the data really trustworthy? That is the starting point, and then only everything else can come after that. I believe I'm doing on time, so when we are talking about some of the conclusions that I'm offering here, it's the increased amount of gray data will continue, in fact. This is the process which will not stop by us just thinking about it or finding the solutions to storing it, analyzing, and so on. At the beginning, we've seen some of those figures, and those figures apparently will increase exponentially. Dominic collected about 150 different types, and I believe that with the development of all these new technologies and new things, in fact, this 150 probably will easily add another 50 or 100 to the types of the gray data, but there would be definitely a requirement for increasing the ways for finding its and defining its trustworthiness. Processing, and this is, I believe, a very interesting thing for all people who are professionally involved with this. Quite often we are acting post factum. In other words, what we are doing, we are given, let's say, a data lake and say, okay, fine, go and organize it. Just a few days ago, there was on LinkedIn a very interesting article about, it was done by some so-called data scientists, I like to call this so-called, data scientists who discovered there is something called catalog. Because they have a problem, and a huge problem was that, in the data lake, you have all kinds of data stored there, but it's very murky waters there. They cannot find anything. There is a problem and so on. So someone nicely invented a wheel and said, okay, fine, maybe we can borrow from something called the catalog and start cataloging this data, and maybe it would be an easier thing to do. My point here is that, whenever you're going into data management and any of these big projects, you have to plan in advance. It is not enough to come and say, okay, fine, let me do it now once everything is done, because at that moment it would be just impossible to do. There are all kinds of environmental, technical, as well as economic and financial, social, and organizational constraints, which need to be taken into consideration for so-called long-term GD sustainability. Usability of gray literature and gray data too requires adequate IT tools, and of course the IT tools are always ahead of so-called HR tools or humans who in fact need lots of training, and for that to get a degree it takes like 4, 5, 6 years, and by the time you finish it, it's completely probably useless knowledge because technology completely changed. So probably online lifelong learning and all these things probably need to be combined in order to meet this requirement. Yes, intensive training, widespread cooperation, and proper management is needed. And this is the last one, which I already mentioned, that only a small % of businesses extract full value from the data they hold. And the use of new IT tools such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, and similar might help. I'm not saying it will help, but it might help get more value out of it and improve business results and bring something called measurable efficiency gains and increased quality of products and services. So this was the shortest I could do, and I can see here the minute sign is just about to come up. Thank you very much.